Here with us now, two people close to this issue with two very different perspectives, Alderman Rick Munoz and political commentator Dan Proft. Dan, let's talk about the sanctuary city designation. What do you think about that?
Well, this was something that was passed by ordinance by the City of Chicago in 2006, and the problem with it, or the irony of it really, particularly in the context of the recently passed Arizona law, is the same proponents of this kind of legal fiction called sanctuary city are opponents of the Arizona law. So at the same time they're saying it's okay for Chicago to intervene and kind of write its own rules with regards to immigration enforcement, it's not okay for Arizona to do the same thing, even though Chicago's ordinance is in some ways at odds with federal immigration policy, where Arizona's is consistent with federal immigration policy.
It isn't. What the city ordinance basically says is that city services will not be denied to anyone based on immigration status. And what you're talking about in Arizona is that you're using municipal services to enact federal legislation. And we all know that the supremacy clause of Article 6 of the Constitution says that when it comes to these matters, it is the U.S. government, it is the federal government that does this, not state by state by state. What the sanctuary cities ordinance is, specifically Chicago says, the ordinance says, is that you will not be denied city services based on immigration status, whether it's police service, fire department service, or anything of the like, because as residents of the city, you should be getting your garbage picked up, regardless of immigration status.
But Alderman Munoz, it goes further than that. It really puts law enforcement at the local level back on its heels. Rather than law enforcement being proactive, working with ICE, working with federal law enforcement, it puts it back on its heels and says, don't do anything unless the federal government comes to you and says, we're enlisting your help.
Federal law and federal regulations are very clear of when they need our help, when it's municipal, and they tell us whenever you have someone who's been convicted of a crime, you need to notify Department of Homeland Security for their deportation. That's already being done. That's already taking place. What we're saying here is that, do you honestly believe that we should require police officers to check immigration statuses before they provide city services?
No, that's not the issue, and that's not the issue with the Arizona law. The issue is if somebody is suspected of committing a crime, and that's the first order of business.
So they're already guilty.
No. I said suspected. That's the first order of business.
The Arizona law allows law enforcement essentially to inquire of their legal status once they've been picked up for something else.
Correct.
And it does have an anti-profiling clause in it, so that they can't, according to the law, they can't use their race or ethnicity as a reason for stopping them.
That's precisely right.
Alderman Munoz, would you agree that that's right?
So what you're saying, well, that's what they say, that you can't use it as a primary reason to stop. But how does the sheriff of Mayberry or the sheriff of this small town who has a 3 or 4 or 10 staff department train their department if the federal government or the state are not providing these training services to identify or to be able to basically enforce this law that is being thrust upon these local communities?
Let me
and you've got, like, in Illinois, you've got local law enforcement officials who all have come together and said they want comprehensive immigration reform because it shouldn't be upon the local law enforcement agencies to do this, just because that would put a budgetary strain.
Munoz, you don't believe that local authorities should be getting that involved in deportations and immigration issues? Do you think they should pretty much stay out of that?
Local law enforcement should be enforcing the local laws, which is, your traffic laws. I mean, if somebody's violating the law, they should get arrested. If somebody gets convicted, they should be reported to Homeland Security, and then if the conviction requires deportation, then that's that. But local law enforcement should not be going around checking whether or not people have federal documents to be here legally.
Well, first of all, that is one of the responsibilities of citizenship, is to be able to prove it up, if so called, to do so. Secondly, the reason that Arizona and other local communities are stepping in is because the federal government has abrogated its responsibility in this area.
Then fight to change your federal government. You have the
federal government, you have the Bureau of Land Management, the federal government putting up signs in the demilitarized zone between Arizona and Mexico that say, warning Americans, don't come into this area even though it's American soil, because there's drug traffickers and human traffickers, and this is dangerous. They're ceding control of our soil, and that's why people are upset.
Let's bring it back to a really important issue. Let's bring it back to a really important issue here, because I think a lot of people get confused here. How is our law, or is our law, what we are enforcing here, any different than what they're doing in Arizona?
It really isn't terribly different,
isn't. We're just saying,
except to the extent that you empower local law enforcement. And Arizona, to Alderman Munoz's point, Arizona is saying we're willing to provide the resources for the training that you speak of, because we want to empower local law enforcement to be part of the solution, as opposed to just conceding the problem.
Well, I mean, what we're saying in Chicago is that we are not going to deny anyone city services based on immigration status.
Okay.
If what Dan wants and what the radical Republican right wants
that's not what I want.
Is to racially profile.
That's
and
not
say
true.
That just because you happen to be brown-skinned, just because you happen to speak Spanish, we're going to check your papers.
Alderman Munoz, you know, the kind of the race baiting is the last act of a desperate person who doesn't have the substance right. Nobody is suggesting that people should be racially profiled. Nobody is suggesting that people should be denied services. We are talking about enforcement of law. You've got
the law's already being enforced.
It is not being enforced. Talk to people on the border and talk about the drug cartels and the impact that those organizations are having.
I agree with you. I agree with you that the border needs to be secure. I agree with you that the border needs to be secured. But how you deal with it internally within these states is a totally different approach than to go and allow these local law enforcement agencies to be checking for people's documentation status, because then you're just going to have racial profiling run rampant.
Then the federal government needs to do its job.
We're going to have to wrap it up. We're going to have to wrap things up there, you guys. We agree on something. That's a perfect place.
Well, two things.
We appreciate the lively debate tonight from both of you.
Thank you for
joining us. Dan Proft and Alderman Rick Munoz.